He mocked him for his red MAGA hat every chance she got, but when her career was on the brink of collapse, it was the man she least expected who saved her, and her entire world flipped upside down. What happened next will leave you speechless. Never underestimate simplicity. Sometimes, the most unassuming people hold the greatest strength. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The hum of keyboards filled the air, punctuated by ringing phones and hurried conversations. Nexus Innovations was alive with energy, its open floor layout brimming with focused professionals darting between desks and meeting rooms. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of papers and electronics, while monitors flickered with endless lines of code and graphs. The company, a growing force in the software industry, thrived on creativity and collaboration. Yet behind the polished exterior, tension simmered just below the surface. Emily Carter sat in her glass-walled office, her gaze fixed on the glowing screen in front of her. Lines of code scrolled endlessly as she scoured for answers. The overhead lights seemed harsher than usual, reflecting the stress carved into her face. A team lead in her mid-30s, Emily was ambitious and sharp, known for her relentless drive to meet goals. Yet those who worked with her also knew her other side: the quick judgments, the sharp tongue, and the quiet dismissal of people she deemed undeserving of her attention. Her reputation wasn't unwarranted. Emily's strong opinions often dominated conversations, and she had a habit of categorizing people within seconds. One man in particular had repeatedly drawn her ire: James Richards, with his calm demeanor and worn red MAGA hat, always seemed out of place at Nexus Innovations. His occasional appearances at the office had become a source of quiet frustration for Emily. To her, he looked like someone who didn't belong, a relic of old values, someone who had nothing to contribute to the modern cutting-edge company she valued so highly. She'd seen him wandering the halls, speaking briefly to managers or observing quietly from the back of rooms during presentations. His silence made her uncomfortable. The hat, with its bold text, "Make America Great Again," became the centerpiece of her assumptions. Emily had whispered her thoughts to colleagues on more than one occasion, her sarcasm carrying through the air, just loud enough to sting. "Does he think this is a rally? What's he even doing here?" she had scoffed once, when she passed him in the break room. James never reacted. He would meet her judgmental gaze with a faint, polite nod, then move along, as though her remarks meant nothing. His calm infuriated her more than she cared to admit. She convinced herself he was likely some external consultant or supplier, someone called in for a minor job and unimportant enough for her to care about. On this particular day, however, Emily's thoughts were consumed not by James, but by the blinking error messages that flashed across her screen. Her team had uncovered a critical bug buried deep within the software they had been preparing to launch. Days before the release, this issue threatened to undo months of work. Worse still, the company's largest deal depended on this launch being flawless. The stakes had never been higher, and Emily felt the pressure of it like a tightening noose. Her manager had already visited her office twice that morning, each time more concerned than the last. "We can't afford to miss this deadline," he'd reminded her. "You promised the product was ready. Fix it, or this is going to fall on you." The words echoed in her mind as she rubbed her temples, frustration mounting. She glanced through the glass walls of her office, watching her team outside. They worked furiously, eyes glued to their screens, exchanging quiet, worried conversations. Emily's leadership was being questioned, and the weight of that realization sat heavily on her shoulders. The phone on her desk rang suddenly, breaking the silence. She snatched it up, her voice tight. "Cotter speaking." Her manager's voice boomed through the receiver. "We're already hearing concerns from the client. I need updates, Emily. Fix this, or..." He left the rest unsaid, but Emily understood the implications perfectly. Hanging up the phone, she stared blankly at her reflection in the screen. For the first time in her career, she felt the ground beneath her slipping. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as panic began to settle in. No matter what she tried, the bug refused to be resolved, as if mocking her. The office outside remained busy, oblivious to the crisis at hand. Emily rose from her chair and paced toward the window, looking out over the sea of desks. And then she saw him, James Richards. He stood quietly near the break room, hands tucked into his pockets, that same red hat sitting atop his head. He seemed to be observing the room, his calm expression at odds with the chaos swirling in Emily's world. Her irritation flared once again. "What does he even do here?" she muttered to herself. She shook her head and turned away, focusing back on her screen, but her thoughts were still rattled. James had a way of lingering in her mind, his presence a silent challenge to everything she thought she knew about people like him. As the sun began to dip behind the tall glass walls of Nexus Innovations, Emily's phone buzzed again, a reminder that time was running out. The deal, her reputation, and her future at the company hung by a thread. And yet, somewhere in the quiet corners of the office, James Richards remained an unassuming presence, unnoticed by all but Emily, whose judgments were about to be tested in ways she could never have anticipated. The office felt like a ghost town as the clock struck midnight. The once vibrant space, buzzing with energy and chatter, now echoed with the soft hum of computers and the occasional sigh of exhaustion. Emily sat slumped in her chair, her eyes stinging from staring at the screen for hours. The lines of code blurred together as she scrolled endlessly, hoping to spot something, anything, that could explain the bug that refused to be fixed. Her desk was cluttered with empty coffee cups, crumpled notes, and stray pens. The glow of her monitor cast sharp shadows across her tired face as she leaned back, pressing her palms to her temples. The bug wasn't just a setback. It was a disaster waiting to explode. The product launch was only days away, and the executives were growing impatient. Earlier in the day, whispers had begun circulating in hushed voices among her team. Emily hadn't missed the sidelong glances and quiet conversations that stopped whenever she walked by. She knew they were talking about her, about the possibility that the project, under her leadership, might fail. For someone as determined as Emily, the thought of failure was unbearable. She promised this was ready, she overheard one of her developers murmur near the break room hours earlier. Management's already asking questions. The words had cut deeper than she let on. The same team who once respected her leadership now questioned her ability to deliver. Her heart pounded in her chest as anxiety gnawed at her resolve. Her career, the one she had built through years of relentless effort, felt like it was beginning to slip through her fingers. Emily stood abruptly, grabbing her half-empty coffee cup and heading toward the break room. The fluorescent lights flickered as she walked past rows of empty desks. The company's open layout, usually so alive with collaboration, now seemed oppressively large and empty. The break room offered little relief. The vending machine hummed in the corner and the coffee pot was empty. She groaned softly, slamming the cup onto the counter. It was then that she noticed him. James Richards sat quietly at one of the tables near the window, sipping his coffee. The red MAGA hat perched on his head stood out against the sterile surroundings. He didn't seem to be working, just observing, as if he were content watching the quiet hum of the office unfold around him. Emily felt her annoyance flare. Of all people, he was here now? She couldn't understand why this man seemed to show up at the worst times, silently watching without explanation. In her frustration, she muttered just loud enough for a nearby colleague to hear. "Doesn't he have anywhere better to be? He looks so out of place here," she scoffed, shaking her head. "Maybe he's just lost." Her voice carried across the quiet room, and for the briefest moment she was certain he heard. James turned his head slightly, his expression calm and unbothered. Instead of responding, he simply nodded politely, his eyes meeting hers before he returned to his coffee. The simple gesture unsettled her. Emily huffed quietly, spinning on her heel and walking back to her desk. She had bigger problems than an out-of-place man and his ridiculous hat. Using the knife to slice one of the prisoners in two, unbeknownst to Emily, James watched the scene with quiet understanding. Over the years, he had encountered people like her, sharp, capable, but blinded by their own assumptions. He didn't take her words personally. What mattered to him was the company, the people working here, and the projects that represented their collective hard work. Later that evening, as the last of the lights dimmed, and Emily finally gave in to exhaustion, James remained in the shadows of the office. His visits were never random. He had been keeping tabs on the company's projects, quietly assessing how things were running. He had built Nexus Innovations from the ground up. And though he now stayed behind the scenes, his connection to the company and the people remained deeply personal. James had overheard the developers' concerns earlier in the day, their voices anxious as they whispered about the critical bug and the potential fallout. When he learned it was tied to Emily's project, he decided to look into it himself. While the team slept, unaware, James returned to his office at home. He logged into the system remotely, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as he sifted through thousands of lines of code. Despite his role as CEO, James's technical expertise had never dulled. Before founding the company, he had spent years as a software engineer, solving problems that others deemed impossible. Tonight was no different. Hours passed as he analyzed the software, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he found it. The root of the issue buried deep within the code, a minor error that had created a catastrophic failure. James fixed the problem with quiet efficiency, rewriting the code and testing the program until it ran flawlessly. The bug that had plagued the team for days was gone. Satisfied, he logged out and leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting a faint smile on his face. Nick nosed his friend's memory. Was always that way. Back at the office, the building remained still. Emily's desk lamp flickered faintly, illuminating the empty chair where she had spent countless hours fighting a problem she thought would ruin her. She had no idea that somewhere in the quiet of the night, someone had stepped in to save the day, not for praise or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. James sat back, taking a sip of his coffee as he watched the clock tick toward dawn. He knew Emily would never expect his involvement. That didn't matter to him. What mattered was ensuring that Nexus Innovations and the people who worked there succeeded. Tomorrow the team would walk into the office to find their project restored and the launch back on track. James allowed himself one final glance at the Nexus Innovations logo on his screen before shutting it down. The storm had passed, and no one would know who had steadied the ship. Emily arrived at the office the next morning with the weight of dread pressing heavily on her shoulders. The sun was barely up, but the company's glass exterior already glimmered in the soft light. She parked her car and sat still for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her mind replayed the previous night, the blinking error messages, the mounting frustration, and the quiet fear that everything was falling apart. Today, she would have to face the consequences. As she walked into the building, her steps felt heavier than usual. The hum of early morning work had already begun, and team members were settling in at their desks. Emily avoided eye contact as she hurried to her office, clutching a coffee she wasn't even sure she wanted. When she logged into her system, her breath caught. The program was running perfectly. She blinked in disbelief, staring at the screen. Lines of clean, functioning code replaced the broken chaos from the night before. She refreshed it, checked again, and ran the software tests. Everything was flawless. The critical bug, the monster that had kept her awake for days, was gone. It was as if it had never existed. Her pulse quickened, and she leaned back in her chair, stunned. "Who fixed it?" she whispered to herself. Emily pulled up the project logs, hoping to find a name or a timestamp that would explain the miracle. Nothing. There was no indication of who had stepped in or when. She stood abruptly and walked out to her team's workspace. "Who fixed the bug last night?" she asked, scanning the room. The developers exchanged confused looks. Some shook their heads, others looked at their screens, avoiding her gaze. "No one?" Emily pressed. "Come on, someone did this. Who stayed late?" Her voice was louder than she intended, drawing attention from nearby desks. One of the senior developers, Mark, shrugged. "I thought you might have found the fix after we left. None of us touched it." Emily frowned, her frustration mixing with confusion. It didn't make sense. She was the last one working on the project, and when she left, the software was still broken, yet now it was perfect, and no one seemed to have the answers she needed. Before she could push further, her phone buzzed with a notification. An all-hands meeting had been scheduled in the main conference room in 10 minutes. Emily sighed and checked her reflection in the window. Her exhaustion still showed in the dark circles under her eyes, but there was no time to dwell. She grabbed a notebook and joined the stream of employees heading toward the conference room, responded to the priority announcement. The space buzzed with speculation. Employees whispered to each other, trying to guess the reason for the unscheduled meeting. Emily slid into a seat near the front, her mind still on the fixed bug. Senior executives, including the company's COO and project leads, entered the room and took their places at the head of the table. The chatter died down as the COO, a sharp-looking man in his 50s, stepped forward to address the group. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice calm but firm. "As you all know, we've been preparing for one of the most significant launches in the company's history. Over the last few days, this project faced a critical issue that put the entire timeline in jeopardy. Emily's stomach tightened, her heart pounding as she braced herself for what came next. But, the COO continued, his tone brightening, I'm happy to share that as of this morning, the issue has been fully resolved. Thanks to the silent efforts of someone who stepped up at the right moment, the launch is back on track. A wave of relief swept through the room. Emily blinked, processing the words. Silent efforts. Someone had fixed it. Someone who didn't even claim credit. She sat up straighter as the COO turned his attention toward her. Henry, I also want to recognize the leadership of Emily Carter, he announced. Despite the challenges, she led her team through a difficult period, and her hard work helped ensure the project's success. Emily, well done. Applause erupted across the room, and Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. She managed a small smile and nodded in acknowledgement, though a strange mix of relief and guilt settled in her chest. Her leadership was being praised, but deep down, she knew someone else had saved her. As the meeting wrapped up, employees stood and began to file out, buzzing with conversations about the launch. Emily remained in her seat for a moment, replaying the COO's words in her head. Silent efforts. Her gaze wandered toward the back of the room, where a familiar figure caught her eye. James Richards stood there, leaning casually against the wall. His red MAGA hat was unmistakable, the bright letters catching the overhead light. He seemed unbothered by the noise and attention, watching the scene unfold with his usual calm expression. Emily frowned slightly, irritation flickering through her relief. Why is he even here, she thought. The man didn't belong at a high-stakes meeting like this. She assumed he was just another bystander, someone insignificant who had wandered into the room without understanding the gravity of what had just happened. James caught her staring and offered a small nod, the same polite, unreadable nod he always gave her. Emily looked away, dismissing him once again. Now she waited in her diet. As she walked back to her office, the pieces of the puzzle still didn't add up. The bug had vanished overnight, but no one claimed credit. She mulled over the possibilities as she passed co-workers, congratulating her on the project's recovery. She smiled and thanked them, but the nagging question remained in the back of her mind. Who did it? Later that afternoon, Emily found herself staring at her screen, the successful software test still running perfectly. The stress she'd been carrying for days had lifted, yet a part of her felt unsettled. Someone had saved her project, saved her job, and she had no idea who. As she looked out over the office floor, her gaze lingered for a moment on the break room window. James Richards sat there once again, sipping coffee, his MAGA hat perched on his head. For a brief second, something in her mind flickered, like the faintest whisper of a thought she couldn't quite catch. She shook her head, dismissing it as coincidence. There's no way, she muttered to herself, turning her attention back to her work. Outside, James sat in his quiet corner, observing the room as if nothing unusual had happened. His expression remained calm and unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. Emily didn't know it yet, but the silent contributor who had saved her project and her job was sitting right there in plain sight. The soft hum of conversation drifted through the office as Emily sat at her desk, her focus wavering as she reviewed reports for the upcoming product launch. The praise she had received earlier still echoed in her mind, but it didn't sit comfortably. Someone had fixed the software overnight, she knew that much. But no one had come forward, and the mystery gnawed at her. Air hummed. As Emily slammed the file on her desk and looked up from her disposal with a start, she recognized but silently tried to pass on. She couldn't let it go. Her thoughts kept circling back to James Richards. Every time she looked up, he seemed to be there, quiet, unassuming, and always wearing that red MAGA hat that she couldn't stand. There was something strange about how often he was around and how he carried himself. Not like a random visitor or consultant, but with a calm confidence, like he belonged. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Mark, one of the senior developers. "Hey," he said casually, holding a folder. "I wanted to drop off the finalized system reports. Looks like we're officially in the clear for launch." Emily nodded, trying to focus. "Thanks, Mark." She paused as he turned to leave. "Hey, quick question. Do you know anything about who fixed the bug last night? I can't stop wondering." Mark gave her a surprised look. "You really don't know?" Emily frowned. "Know what?" Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess no one told you. It's classic James. He fixed it." "Oh, it's a levity." The words didn't register at first. Emily blinked. "James?" "Yeah, James Richards," Mark clarified. "He's not just some guy wandering around, you know. He's James Richards, the CEO of Nexus Innovations. Owns the whole company." Emily froze, staring at him as if he had just spoken another language. "What? Did you just say?" Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her reaction. "You seriously didn't know? That's the CEO. He keeps a low profile, but he's hands-on when he needs to be. Fixed your bug himself last night." He dropped the report onto her desk and walked off, oblivious to the stunned expression on her face. Emily sat motionless, her mind spinning. James Richards, the CEO, the man I mock. Her heartbeat quickened, and she felt heat rising to her face as fragments of every interaction she'd had with him replayed like a movie reel in her mind. The sarcastic remarks she had made, the disdainful glances, the snide comments whispered to her colleagues about his hat and presence. Each moment came back sharper, harsher. "Tomorrow I make space for you in my mind." Looks out of place here. Doesn't he have anything better to do? Maybe he's just lost. Every word, every assumption felt like a stone dropping into her chest. She remembered the calm nods James would give her in response, his polite indifference to her insults. He never argued, never pushed back, and now she knew why. He wasn't insignificant. He wasn't out of place. He was the man who owned everything she saw around her, the desks, the computers, the projects. And he was the one who had saved her from disaster. Emily sank back in her chair, covering her face with her hands. A wave of guilt crashed over her, heavier than she could bear. How had she been so blind? Her judgment had been immediate and unfair, shaped by nothing more than a hat and the assumptions she tied to it. She had seen James not as a person, but as a symbol of everything she thought she opposed. And yet, while she mocked him, he had quietly observed, quietly helped, and, in the moment it mattered most, quietly stepped in to fix what she couldn't. He had been working all afternoon to master the computer, spreading the color photos that Margaret had provided, and shared them with him as he did so many other things. She turned toward the glass wall of her office, scanning the floor until her eyes found him. James sat in the corner of the break room, his posture relaxed as he sipped his coffee. The red MAGA hat rested on his head, as always, but now Emily saw it differently. It wasn't just a hat. It was part of who he was, but it didn't define him. Her stomach churned as she watched him. The man she had dismissed so easily had shown her a level of grace and kindness she had never deserved. He could have exposed her failure to the entire company. He could have embarrassed her, called her out, or left the problem unsolved as payback for the way she had treated him. But he hadn't. Instead, he saved her career and the company's biggest deal without asking for credit or recognition. Emily thought back to his quiet presence during the meeting that morning. He had stood at the back of the room, listening as the executives praised her leadership. He never said a word, never hinted at the truth. The humility of it stung her more than any harsh words ever could have. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and made her way toward the break room. Her footsteps felt heavier with each step. Her chest tightened as she rehearsed what she wanted to say, though the words felt insufficient no matter how many times she turned them over in her mind. When she reached the break room, James looked up, his expression as calm and unreadable as always. He took a sip of his coffee, waiting for her to speak. For a moment, Emily couldn't find her voice. All the sharpness and pride she usually carried had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming need to make things right. "Mr. Richards," she began softly, her voice trembling slightly, I just found out. Said the doctors said that I... James raised an eyebrow, setting his cup down. Found out what? Emily swallowed hard, her guilt evident. That you're the CEO. That you fixed the project last night. Emily's face turned darker as she replied. James tilted his head as if considering her words. I did what needed to be done, he replied simply. I don't know what to say, Emily admitted, her voice quieter now. I owe you an apology for everything I've said, for how I've treated you. I was wrong. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I'm so sorry. James regarded her for a moment, then offered a small smile. We all make mistakes, Emily, he said gently. What matters is what we learn from them. His calm acceptance of her apology made her throat tighten. He wasn't angry. He wasn't holding it against her. Somehow, his forgiveness made her feel even smaller. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Paul gave her the key. James picked up his coffee again, his smile never wavering. Take care of yourself, Emily, and keep leading your team. They need you. As Emily turned to leave, her shoulders felt lighter, but her mind was heavy with reflection. James had shown her a level of kindness and humility that she would carry with her forever. In a moment when he could have proven her wrong in the harshest way, he had chosen to teach her something far more valuable. For the first time, she understood just how much she still had to learn. The next morning, Emily stood outside the break room, her heart pounding as she rehearsed what she wanted to say. Her usual confidence was nowhere to be found, replaced by a nervous vulnerability that made her feel exposed. But she knew this moment couldn't be avoided. She owed James an apology, not just for her own peace of mind, but because it was the right thing to do. As she stepped inside, she found James sitting at his usual spot, a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as she approached, his expression calm and kind as always. Emily hesitated for a moment, clutching the back of the chair across from him. "Mr. Richards," she began softly, her voice trembling. James set his coffee down and tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to continue. "I owe you an apology," she said, her words spilling out faster than she intended. "I judged you unfairly. I made assumptions about you, about who you were, because of something as meaningless as a hat. And I treated you poorly because of it. I didn't know who you really were, and I'm so sorry." She looked down at the table, her voice faltering as she added, "Thank you for saving the project, for saving my job. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it." James was silent for a moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was gentle. "It's okay, Emily," he said, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had braced herself for anger, for resentment, even for dismissal. But instead, James had offered her forgiveness without hesitation, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Sometimes," he continued, "the way we treat others says more about us than it does about them." Emily swallowed hard, nodding. "I won't forget this," she said earnestly, her voice barely above a whisper. James smiled faintly, lifting his coffee again. "Good," he said simply, "because it's a lesson worth remembering." Emily left the break room with a strange sense of relief, though the weight of her actions still lingered. She had been wrong, deeply, embarrassingly wrong, and James had every right to hold it against her. Yet, he had chosen grace over vindication, kindness over retribution. It was a lesson she would carry with her long after this day. Later that week, Emily decided to express her gratitude in a way that felt more personal. She spent an evening baking cookies, something she hadn't done in years. The next morning, she placed the cookies in a neat box and left them on James's desk, along with a handwritten note. The note read, "Thank you for showing me the power of kindness and humility. Your actions taught me more than words ever could, and I'll carry this lesson forward. Emily." James found the note later that day and smiled softly as he read it. He didn't say anything to Emily, but the simple gesture resonated with him. For all her flaws and missteps, she was learning, and that was enough for him. Over the following weeks, the company buzzed with renewed energy as the successful product launch brought in praise and new opportunities. Emily, now more self-aware, began to engage with her colleagues in a way she hadn't before. She listened more, judged less, and focused on fostering collaboration rather than control. Her team noticed the change, though no one spoke of it directly. One afternoon, as Emily walked down the hallway, she passed James. He was speaking quietly with one of the senior developers, his signature red MAGA hat still perched on his head. For the first time, Emily didn't feel a flicker of irritation or judgment when she saw it. Instead, she saw James for who he truly was, a leader, a mentor, and a man of quiet strength. Their eyes met briefly, and James gave her a small nod, the same polite gesture he had always given. This time, Emily returned it with a warm smile. In that moment, no words were needed. As Emily sat at her desk later that day, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The experience had shaken her, humbled her, and ultimately changed her. She thought back to the assumptions she had made, the judgments she had passed without ever stopping to understand the person behind them. And she thought about James, how he had chosen to lead, not with anger, but with grace. A simple truth lingered in her mind, one that she knew would stay with her forever. Sometimes, the people we judge the harshest are the ones who teach us the most valuable lessons. And there, the story beautifully explores the challenges and transformations that arise when preconceived notions are confronted with reality. It delves into how assumptions based on surface-level judgments can distort our understanding of others and the damage that can cause. Emily's biases blind her to the quiet strength and immense value James brings, focusing instead on a symbol that represents her personal frustrations. As the story unfolds, kindness emerges as the most powerful force. James's ability to forgive Emily despite her dismissive behavior highlights the impact of compassion in disarming negativity and fostering meaningful connections. His actions teach that kindness is not a sign of weakness, but a profound strength that can inspire others to reflect and grow. Emily's journey is one of redemption, as she confronts the discomfort of realizing her mistakes and takes steps toward change. The experience humbles her, leading to a newfound appreciation for the complexity and dignity of others, regardless of appearances or assumptions. Through her growth, the story demonstrates how genuine encounters can lead to profound personal transformation, turning ignorance into understanding and division into unity. The narrative emphasizes that in treating others with respect and kindness, we not only uplift them, but also discover the best within ourselves. What did you think of this story? Have you ever judged someone too quickly or experienced a moment that changed your perspective? Share your thoughts and real-life experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories to remind us of the power of kindness and understanding.